I'm Putsata Reang. I'm a journalist and very recently an author. And my new book, Ma'ami, it came out just about a year ago this time, actually, and it came out in May of last year. And it's the first memoir that I've written. It tells the story of my life and my career trajectory as a journalist, which actually started here at the University of Oregon, here in this building, in fact, here in Allen Hall, with the School of Journalism and Communications. And it traces my life as a journalist, working for daily newspapers here in the U.S. up and down the West Coast before I ended up moving abroad and working internationally with journalists. But I actually pivoted, and instead of being the person to write stories, I became a journalism trainer, and so I helped reporters all across the world, different countries, better tell their country's stories and their own stories. I would say also, at its core, the book really traces this idea and this theme of debt, duty, and the things that we owe our parents, but also a bigger question, which is the things that we owe ourselves. And it really centers on this conflict between my mom and I that becomes sort of a mashup of my identities and a push-pull between mother and daughter in terms of how we reclaim our selfhood. And in my case, being a gay Cambodian refugee became a real point of contention between my mother and I, because she had raised me and my siblings within a very conservative Cambodian culture, but also within the context of America. I spent my entire life in Corvallis, Oregon, and so for all intents and purposes, I grew up believing and knowing that I was American. And so to balance those two pieces of identity became really difficult as the years went on. So much of me wanted to maintain my fidelity to my Cambodian culture, but then the American side of me thought, well, I'm here in America, and in America we get to choose who we love, we get to choose where we want to live, we get to choose to go to school. There's so much freedom here. And so the book really kind of toggles and examines that conflict. I actually never intended to write this particular memoir. In fact, I tried really hard not to. I had always wanted to write a book about my parents and the central question and central idea about survivor's guilt, because my family, we immigrated to the U.S. in 1975, and we were sort of cleaved from our homeland because of the war and genocide in Cambodia. As my mother tells it, we would have never left Cambodia had there not been a war that essentially forced us to move, because had we stayed, almost certainly my family would have been killed because of my father's connection with the Cambodian government. He was an accountant in the Cambodian Navy, but just by sheer fact that he was affiliated with the Cambodian government would have put us as prime targets when the communists took over our country in 1975. And so I'd always really been fascinated by this notion of survivor's guilt. And there were two types of surviving happening in the 70s. In Cambodia, I would later learn, my relatives were busy trying to physically survive torture and starvation and really grueling working conditions. And at the same time, in the US, my parents were busy with the emotional aspect of surviving, and that was the survivor's guilt of leaving behind one's country, coming to the realization several years later that many of your siblings and family members died in the genocide. And it was a question that I've always been curious about, and it always affected me, because I know that their survivor's guilt manifested in our home in so many ways. Manifested in my mother's depression, manifested in my father's inability to cope with stress, which came out in violence within our home. And so there's some hard truths that I talk about in my memoir, because I'm hoping that part of what I wrote will spur some engagement and bigger discussion about how survivor's guilt and PTSD, all these things that we are now just beginning to talk about, with all the wars raging around in the world. I'm hoping that these kinds of conversations are no longer something that just happens here and there sporadically, but that it becomes part of our collective community dialogue. Spending so much time and so many years of my early career as a daily newspaper reporter, it was really challenging to pivot into writing memoir because there are very different disciplines and very different rigors. What I learned here at the School of Journalism and Communications as a young journalism student was objectivity, fact-finding, truth-telling, accuracy, fairness, balance. All of these really set standards and measurements of how to tell a story. Then suddenly, when I started to write a memoir, I had to throw some of that out the window. Getting the facts right was absolutely crucial, being accurate, telling the truth. Of course, 100% carried over to memoir writing. But it's that piece of objectivity that I really struggled with, because as a journalist, we were always taught you are not in the story. You don't put yourself in the story ever, whether that's vis-a-vis opinions or a certain angle of a story. You try really hard just to present a fair and balanced piece of reporting, news reporting. In memoir, it's the opposite. Memoir places on you as a writer a very different standard. And that standard and that rigor is vulnerability. Do you have the skill to self-reflect? Do you have the skill to be brutally honest about those old wounds that you have, and even like really beautiful and fun and exciting moments also, and looking deeply at your sort of inner landscape to put together some really sort of momentous and milestones of your life and form a narrative that somebody's going to want to read in long form. And so I wrote my book in 4 years. It went through 10 drafts. And I would say the first 3 or 4 drafts, at minimum, my editor had to keep reminding me. She said to me, I want you to take off your reporter's hat and put on your writer's hat. And I was so irritated because I'd only ever been a reporter up until that point. I'd only ever been a journalist. And then how to retrain my mind and retrain, well, my body, actually, myself and my emotions to think about writing and to think about language and communicating in a different way. It was a pretty tough adjustment. I eventually got there, I hope. But, it's one of the things I told my editor. I said, I've got one book in me. That's it, one memoir in me. I'm going to go back to my work as a journalist after this. Because, it's easy. It's so much easier, I think, to tell other people's story than to tell my own story. And it's easier to tell other people's stories because you get to explore with your sources what they're going through and their pain. And you try to formulate a really compelling story based on that. But when it comes to turning the lens on yourself and looking inward, it's a really hard thing. Not very many of us in the world spend a lot of time doing that. And also then to do it well, you've really got to do a lot of reckoning along the way. And I think that was the piece, transitioning from being a journalist to suddenly writing a memoir, that I wasn't prepared to do. I wasn't prepared to do that personal reckoning with myself and my past in order to wrangle with some of these conflicts and some of the complexities of who I am on the page. I mean, while I was writing my memoir, I was still grappling with my own shame over being gay. I mean, this is like active time of literally working on the memoir, and I'm writing about this topic, but I'm still going through the emotions of it. And so it was a really interesting experience. I discovered so many things about myself when I was working on this book. A lot of people throughout my career as a journalist would tell me, put your prose is like poetry. And I never really thought about what that meant until I started writing this book. I mean, I've always loved poetry and I've always had an ear for poetry. I was also an English major here at the University of Oregon. And I remember taking my first poetry class and being so embarrassed because I still to this day cannot write a poem to save my life. But what poetry taught me was an economy of words and how to use language in a way that's compelling, using alliteration and, metaphor, all sorts of writing instruments and writing tricks to be able to convey what I'm trying to say. I didn't know that kind of writing seeped into my journalism work until editors or colleagues pointed that out. And it definitely seeped into my memoir as well. And so I would never call myself a poet, but reviewers have described my book as lyrical, poetic. They've used these kinds of terms. And so I'm kind of I'm sort of reconciling all the pieces of who I am as a writer. And so I've learned to just embrace that and not to worry about, what people are calling my writing, as long as it's compelling and as long as I've put out there a piece of work that people want to read and want to engage with. Along the process, I also learned something that was really hard for me to come to terms with, which was there was a moment in this writing process where we got to the end of the time on when I was going to have to turn in the final draft. And I sent my latest draft to my editor in LA and also my agent in New York. And they both read it at the same time. And I thought, this is the last draft. No more changes. I'm not writing anything else. I was determined to not write any more drafts after this. And interestingly, my editor sent an email about one chapter in particular. And it was this chapter I wrote about Afghanistan and my work there as a journalist. And my editor said to me in her email, this chapter doesn't really fit in with the rest of the narrative. You might consider just cutting it out entirely. I don't really know why it's in there other than to show that you worked in a war zone. And interestingly, my agent came back with a similar email and a similar note that this is way too long. I would cut it to just a couple pages or just take it out. And I was so angry because I thought these two people who have been shepherding my book through all these years didn't understand why that was important to me. But when I went back to reread that chapter, I realized, well, they didn't understand because I didn't make the connection of why it mattered in my story. And it mattered because what had happened before I went to Afghanistan was that I'd gotten into a fight with my mother over me being gay. And it filled me with such shame that when the opportunity came to go work in a war zone, I took it because I didn't care about my life. I didn't care about anything, really. I mean, my self-esteem was just so kind of just in the ditch at that point that, go to a war zone? Sure, let me go out. What do I have to lose? I'm already like the shame of my family. And when I reckoned with that, and when I realized that was the reason I went to Afghanistan, it just made all the more sense why I felt I wanted to include that moment. But I just hadn't formulated that idea at all in early versions of that chapter. It's the only chapter in my book that's not in first person. I wrote it in second person that night that I got the feedback from my editor, because it was the only way that I could wrestle with the emotions, distance myself enough to be able to rewrite that chapter. And I wrote it in second person, almost in a way to bring the reader into that experience and go through that experience with me. And when I turned it in at 3 a.m. when I finished it, and waited the next day. I turned it into my editor, waited the next day to hear her response. My editor doesn't give compliments regularly. In fact, it's hard to get any compliment from her. And she sent me back this one word, wow, in all caps. This is beautiful. And so what got published is exactly what I wrote that night. There was nothing changed. And I asked her, I said, don't I need to change this to I? Because the rest of the book is I. And she said, leave it. It's powerful as it is. And I think that that's one of those stylistic pieces of writing, especially long form, that makes a point and it says something. And And hopefully it causes the reader to stop and consider, oh, this is interesting. Like, why suddenly are we shifting to second person point of view? And then to realize, oh, it's because of the emotional weight of what this author's trying to say. And I love the fact that my editor wanted to preserve that emotional weight rather than have me revert that chapter back to I, because I really feel like that's probably one of the strongest chapters in the book. My time here at the School of Journalism Communications was absolutely pivotal in who I would eventually become. I like to tell the story about how, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I think that throughout the course of our lives, when we get an education, we always remember the teachers that had an impact on us. We remember bullies too, because I did name a bully in my book. You know, you want to misbehave, I'm going to put you in my book by name. And I did, Kevin Rose. And but more than that, we remember the really good teachers, the ones that made an impact on us. And in my case, the ones who believed in me and had confidence in me. And there are two that I was so lucky to have in my lifetime and in my career as a student, I will say, or in my time as a student. And they came at opposite ends of my life as a student. The first person and teacher to really believe in me and instill in me a sense of confidence was my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Hedges, in Corvallis, Oregon at Wilson Elementary School. And I arrived in kindergarten, as Mrs. Hedges likes to say, small and scared. I didn't speak English. And up until that point, my Khmer language was the only language that I knew. And I had older siblings who would come home and they would speak this weird language. They were speaking the English words that they were learning. And I was just mesmerized. I was terrified because then, they knew things I didn't know. And I also didn't know at that young age that I was going to learn this new language called English also. But when I arrived at Mrs. Hedges' class, not speaking a single word of English, she understood that. And she took great pains to help me learn the alphabet, which everybody else in class already arrived in kindergarten knowing the alphabet. And eventually she taught me one-syllable words like cat and run and hat. And eventually by the end of that year, I was singing the alphabets probably louder than anybody. I was so proud that I knew the alphabets and I could say some words. And I think about that moment and I think about how lucky I was to have a Mrs. Hedges in my life who could see, oh, the student needs just a little bit more of a push and maybe a little bit extra nudge from me. And she gave me that. And from that, I fell in love with poetry early on when I was hearing Dr. Seuss and other poetry. And then I get through school and I arrive here at the University of Oregon campus in the halls of Allen Hall, taking reporting classes, journalism classes, and I end up in a reporting 2 class taught by Bob Welch. And Bob Welch at the time, he was reporter at the Eugene Register-Guard. And the way in which he taught his class, he did everything he could to simulate real-life reporting. He would take us out to a very busy intersection on campus and try to simulate a car accident has happened. I'm the police chief. We're going to do a press conference. What are the questions? And I remember being so annoyed, like, why is he taking us out in the rain, out by the road? I can't hear. And then suddenly in the classroom, you realize, oh, this is actually real life, what's going to happen. And he prepared me so well for how it would be as a real life journalist outside of a campus environment, campus atmosphere. But he did also one thing that really seeded the rest of my trajectory as a reporter. He pulled me aside after class one day and he said to me, Putsata, there's a job opening at the Register-Guard. I think you should apply. And I kind of laughed not because it was a funny thing, but because of the timing of his urging, which was that I had applied at the campus paper, the Daily Emerald, and didn't get accepted for a job. And so I thought, well, how am I ever going to get a job at the local city newspaper if our campus newspaper didn't even hire me? But I ended up putting my name in at the Register-Guard. and I got the job. What I didn't know in that moment was that that one job would open the door to every job after that. That one job led to the next skipping stone, which was a summer internship. In the summer of 1995, after I left the University of Oregon with my journalism diploma in hand that I was so proud to hold, and the summer internship that I got at the Oregonian, right after graduating from the University of Oregon School of Journalism Communications, then opened the door for my first, what I consider my first real full-time job, which was to be a reporter in Spokane, Washington at the Spokesman Review. That job led me to the Seattle Times, which eventually led me down to California at the San Jose Mercury News. In my mind, I can draw a direct line. In the 10 years I was a journalist for newspapers on the West Coast, I can draw a direct line from the University of Oregon Journalism School and that moment that my teacher believed in me enough to say, hey, you should apply for this job. All the way throughout, winning awards at the San Jose Mercury News, and getting to a place in my career where I just thought, no, this is where I belong. This is who I am. There's nothing I would rather do than be a journalist. And so I think that being here and getting a really fantastic education here, there was great faculty in 1992 to 1995 when I was going to school here. I've met a lot of the faculty here now, and I would say the same, tremendous faculty who are teaching the next crop of journalists in a very rigorous standard of journalism. You can't get a better education in journalism than here. And, I was one of those students who thought, am I cutting myself, am I giving myself short shrift here by not applying for and going to an Ivy League school and getting an education at, say, Columbia Journalism School or one of these other, Northwestern even, what I understood to be the top journalism schools. And I realized after the fact, no, I was at a top journalism school here in Eugene. And I'll defend that to my dying day. Coming back to Allen Hall after nearly 30 years it's been a really strange and interesting and beautiful and inspiring experience all the way around. I mean, there's so many emotions. It's a dream, really, but more than that, it's a homecoming. It feels that way to me. I feel like even 30 years later, I was just thinking about this coming to campus today. I feel like I belong here still. I felt like I belonged back then. And that's a 28-year spread. And so there's something about the ecosystem or the environment here. I think I know what it is, because when I had lunch with the dean yesterday, he articulated it for me, the thing that I felt so long ago. He said, everybody here is so welcoming. And that's what it is. That's what it was for me back then in 1992 when I first came here. And now we're here in 2023, and that's what it feels today. And so there's some special mix of things happening here where the environment is it's conducive to learning because you feel like you belong. And we spend our entire lives trying to figure out where we belong. And when you find that place, it's pretty special. And so the welcome that I've received from the faculty, from the students, the phenomenal questions I've fielded from this upcoming batch of J-School students, all of that is just really creating this really remarkable moment for me to be here again. I did say one thing to Professor Loffer yesterday about walking through these halls. I feel so big, or maybe I just felt so small back then as a student, but just maybe the years, or I don't know what it was, but I felt like a little tiny stone back then, and maybe it took being a professional journalist and returning to realize, no, actually, everything's in perspective, but, I'm definitely more wiser and definitely more mature than how I was in my teenage years being here. Oh, what's next for me is such a big question because I don't have an answer to give you on that. I don't know yet. I know that I've got other books in me. I don't know if they are memoir. Probably not. I think that writing this one memoir took so much out of me physically and emotionally that I'm not sure I've got what it takes to do it one more time. But I'm fascinated by a lot of different things. And so I had this conversation recently with my agent about what's next. And for me, it's going to be one of a couple different directions. I will either pivot back to journalism in a big way, or I will stick with writing books and continue to write books. It's actually possible that I could do both. I'm not sure how that would look. But right now, what I realized is that I really like the long form. I really like spending a big chunk of time in isolation, writing on one topic, writing on one thing. I'd spent 20 years of my life as a reporter, 10 of those years as a daily newspaper reporter, where you write such short stories that they come out in the paper the next day, you do it again the next day. But to really just sink into and marinate in an issue is something that I realize that I like, and I'll very likely do another book. Not sure what it is yet, but I know I'll probably go in that direction.